I was hoping to ask some questions to Alva, but maybe there'll be time for questions at the very end. Okay, just give me a minute here to set this up. Okay, I'm going to talk for about half an hour. I've got such a loud voice, I don't need that. I'll have it anyway, just in case. About human nature, free will, agency, responsibility, and the ecological emergency. The talk is based roughly on my PhD thesis. I'll spend about 5 minutes on each of those 5 things, and then I'll see if I can draw them together, and then if you've got questions, I'm very happy to attempt to answer anything. If we get lost or bogged down, the issues I'm talking about are big issues. I'm a philosopher, so some of the things I've drawn in are quite big issues. If you can, just bear with me to the end, and as far as possible, at the end, I'll attempt to repair any broken lines in understanding. So the first thing I want you to think about is what human nature is and what humans are. It's a real challenge for most of us to put aside our intuitive responses to this kind of question. The fact is that we're largely conditioned by our intuitions, and we rationalize them after the event, as it were. So if we can just step back from reacting for a moment, and from our views of the world as they're dictated by, for instance, our religious or ideological beliefs, then let's see if we can meet on a scientific basis. Most humans who've had the benefit of an education now understand that the best theory we have of our origins is the theory of evolution. And the best way to interpret this theory is to consider humans as a part of and not apart from the rest of existence. This doesn't necessarily exclude the idea of there being a God, but it nests us more in the systems that exist around and within us, because it sees us as being evolved beings, beings which are made up of physical, electrochemical systems, and which have co-evolved with us. We're largely made up of water, for instance, and our bodies contain trillions of microorganisms, which outnumber human cells by about 10 to 1. The air that becomes our breath becomes air again each time we exhale. To suggest we're separable or divisible from the systems in and around us is, therefore, unjustified. We're human, yes, but we're a lot more than human. Seeing us as natural beings enmeshed in natural systems can appear to contradict how we've been taught to think about ourselves. It's likely, for instance, that you've absorbed an understanding of yourself, if you grew up in a Judeo-Christian tradition, that you have a kind of double nature. In other words, that you believe that we have our earthly physical selves and that we have a soul. This is so embedded in all our myths and stories, in how we talk about, oh good, there's a connection with the last speaker. So we have this liminality, this idea that there's an edge between us, or between stages of ourselves and something else, a boundary. This is so embedded in all our myths and stories and how we talk and think about ourselves that most of us carry this picture of ourselves subconsciously. Yet when we return to the theory of evolution and reflect, we can see this picture as a hangover, as it were, of ideological thinking that began or possibly preceded the Judeo-Christian era, and which conceives of humanity as having souls that are made of immaterial, spiritual stuff inside physical bodies. Cartesian dualism built on and amended this. Most of us have heard the phrase cogito ergo sum, or I think therefore I am, and the implication is clear. We have a thinking thing, a mind, a kind of ghost, in a physical thing, a body, a kind of machine. The thinking thing controls the material thing, pulling virtual levers. indicating what we will or want to do. So this brings me to the second issue, free will. If we're evolved physical beings and we take a virtual Alka-Seltzer for our dualistic two natures hangover, we arrive at the understanding that in fact our ability to react to what is happening to us is contiguous with the reactivity of all systems everywhere. This brings free will into question. Oh, sorry, I'm not there yet. Back. Oh well. I'll come to Big Bang Theory in a minute. You didn't pick the society into which you were born. There isn't a cell in your body that you chose, and you certainly didn't pick your parents. Not only is this true for you, it's true for all humans. And of course, not only is it true of all humans, but since we're in the same boat as all other creatures, and indeed all other systems and matter in the universe, it's also true of them. If this is true, then it's also true that everything in the universe is interacting with everything else, and it's worthwhile attempting to understand what this kind of interaction is. If we return to our scientific evidence of what's going on, we get the Big Bang Theory, which states that there was an event of some sort, not that kind of Big Bang, this kind of Big Bang, that there was an event of some sort and energy and matter came into existence in a kind of massive explosion or bang. As the universe has expanded, all this energy and matter has, according to the second law, tended to, as Yeats put it, fall apart. We and all other matter and energy react in order to dissipate energy. And yet living things run counter to the second law. Instead of just falling apart, we exist in a kind of whirlpool, as planets, stars, and other systems do, including, of course, human systems. We maintain a resistance to entropy through replication, that is, having babies, or in our case, evolution, that consistently reorganizes matter into patterns that replicate and thus graduates energy through a dissipated flow. What this means in terms of reaction is that elements like hydrogen and oxygen react, but so do all the systems we're involved in and made up of. We and all other elements in existence are in a constant state of reaction. If you like, you can think of the universe as a mathematical equation working itself out. We're part of the equation, so free will is an illusion. Agency is the capacity to act as a catalyst in a reaction. Our agency, in more specific terms, our moral agency, our ability to decide to do good or evil, is fundamental to our sense of being human. All religions are based on this idea. But if free will is an illusion, then so is agency. We are not free to choose, and therefore we are not agents that participate in a battle for good or ill. We are points in a mathematical unfolding, and that leaves us pretty impotent when it comes to acting to do good or harm. Yet there is a chink of light. We are also, accidentally, conscious. The capacity we have to be conscious and aware comes into being as an accident of our evolutionary history. It happened to be the case that what worked for us in survival terms was our ability to imagine and to use our brains to consider ourselves as part of the action. This gave us the capacity to see ourselves in the picture, as it were, while things were going on. This very capacity, which came about just by chance, is also the capacity which allows us the potential to look at what is going on while it is going on. If we look at what is going on while it is going on, which is what I'm asking you to do now, we begin to realize that we are, and all things are, caught in this web of existence. It is not our faults, and there is nothing that we can do anything about. It is just the nature of existence. When we really reflect on this, something else interesting happens. We elicit, or what is elicited is, I argue, compassion for all that's going on. Because when we see everything that's going on as a kind of enmeshed unfolding of existence, then it's a bit like watching ants in an anthill, or humanity as going through the process of thinking itself free and yet not being free. And we don't become compassionate. Compassion is elicited, bubbles up in us as a response to this realization. Okay. So Sam Harris said that when we recognize, so Sam Harris had this metaphor, Sam Harris said that when we recognize that everything we think or do arises from these prior causes, this is an antidote to the arrogance and that we think that we are entitled to the kinds of lives that we have. And it's a profound basis for compassionate, a compassionate attitude to others who are less lucky. What is elicited, I said that already. So this then becomes our agency. Our agency is not what we choose to do. It's the gap between us realizing where we are right now and what's going on right now, and the possibilities that arise when we create that space. So we then, instead of reacting to what's going on, which we are involved in, and that's what makes us part of the universe, we respond, which is a slightly different thing. And when we respond, that's when we have responsibility. So this takes us to the final issue. What are we responding to? You can't make yourself compassionate. You can only keep stepping back and becoming a larger container in which compassion, which exists, wants to live. So, yes, to the International Panel on Climate Change report. So what are we responding to? I argue that what we're responding to is this profound and existentially challenging crisis, this global crisis, the like of which our species, and indeed the planet, has never experienced. I've called it the ecological emergency, and that's how I see it. And you'll have to excuse my language now, because it's existential, it's our existence that is at threat, but it is not the planet that is at threat, because nature, as has been said many times by other people, is a tough bitch. She will survive. We, certainly not without massive suffering, may not. In other words, it's quite likely that humans as a species will survive, but how our societies survive is the important thing. And what survives of us as societies is the important thing. How we deal with this emergency is the important thing, because if we deal with it as through this process of eliciting compassion and creating more resilience between ourselves by exercising compassion, then we have a chance of creating societies after, if you like, the crisis, or through the crisis, which are more resilient. If we go down the route of competition and selfishness, then the societies that will be created will be likely much more fractured and much more vulnerable to collapse. Okay, so I've called it the ecological emergency, and that's how I see it. It's somehow more than that. It's the connection between the internal and the external worlds, because there is actually no difference between them, and that's a scientific fact. You know, we are continuous with the external world. We don't have an external internal difference. We create technological solutions to the eco-emergency, like trying to deal with climate change by seeding clouds to create cloud cover, so we don't have to face the dangers of the increasingly dangerous sun in a thinning atmosphere. But in fact, if we take that route and societies become more fragmented, then that route is going to create possible triggers where one society can attack another society by attacking the system that we've used to defend ourselves against the thinning atmosphere. So it's not a good a long-term strategy. Instead, we need to understand that the problem is a problem of attitude. If we can understand that the internal and external worlds are inseparable, except for convenience sake, and that the ecological emergency is an emergence in the internal world and the external world. In other words, it's an emergence in us. It's a manifestation of our own fragmentedness, if you like, our own crises. Then we can begin to address it using attitude. And the attitude that emerges when we reflect on our interactions, we can find that compassion wells up in us. In practical terms, what does this mean? It means that we need to create resilience in communities and individually to the issues that we face as a result of the ecological emergency. So blaming one party or political entity like Trump isn't actually going to solve the problem. It's simply going to say that they over there are a part of us which we refuse to own. It's all us. We need to own it all, and we need to respond to what is it about us that we're finding difficult to incorporate. Because societies are never going to be ideal, they're never going to be perfect, and we as human beings are never going to be perfect. I mean, we're all muddling through the best we can. So when we own that, instead of trying to create a perfect society, then we'll get one step closer towards a more resilient response. So there, the counter argument, or the counter approach, if you like, is this approach of lifeboat ethics. Lifeboat ethics is a phrase that was used in the 1960s by a biologist called Garrett Hardin, and he also coined the phrase the tragedy of the commons, which is you can't see it now, but the global warming of 1.5 degrees, and yet in the budget last week there was no carbon tax, so there's no acceptance that we actually all have to respond to this. I'm not keen on the idea of raising the price of fuel because I have to pay for it. But we need to be responsible collectively. So Garrett Harding said that the tragedy is that it's a personal loss if there's a common good and when we have to take a hit for it. There's an old Irish system of land use, of commonage. I think it was at the end of the peninsula until very recently. Until about the 1970s, and this meant that there was a Ri, I think he was called, a king who took the role of land manager for 2 years at a time. So when they did that, they would decide how many cattle you could have on this common land, and it was in his interests to be sensible about it, because in 2 years' time, somebody else, if he put all his cattle on the land and destroyed the land, then the next person might do the same thing. So it was in everybody's interest to balance selfishness and altruism, and that's the tricky part of dealing with common goods like climate. So just to close, there's a temptation to go down that route, the route of lifeboat ethics, which is effectively what Trump is doing in his management of the United States at the moment, to say, these people belong in my moral compass, and those people in Mexico, for instance, don't. But it is a dangerous, and it's actually been proven to be an ineffective and inaccurate way of understanding the commons. Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize for Peace, I think it was, or a Nobel Prize, she was an economist. She did a study in Los Angeles of the management of the water. Obviously, California has a water shortage problem, but the management of water systems in California, she proved was managed successfully to the benefit of all the people in the part of the state where she did her study, because it was in everybody's interest to ensure that everybody had enough water. Because if you made one system fragile, you made it more likely that wildfires would rage and those fires would sweep out of control. So it was actually in everybody's interest to contribute. So Garrett Hardin's lifeboat ethics isn't a successful strategy. And in fact, if we look at other systems, at other evolved systems, we can see that strategy has failed in every evolutionary system that has managed to survive. If a system survives long term, it becomes more complex. So rainforest systems are very complex systems, and they're very resilient. But monocultures, for instance, are very fragile. You know, if you get a virus or a disease or indeed a fire, the system is likely to be destroyed. So complex systems have evolved because species understand, if I can use that word without meaning a conscious understanding, that cooperation or a strategy of, if you like, aggressive cooperation is more beneficial to all the systems involved than a system of pure competition. If we follow a strategy of cooperation and compassion, while also calling out examples of free riding and psychopathologies like sociopathology and lack of empathy, which certainly exists as an element of the human genome, the human species can and should manage to deal in good measure with the problems it has created and to contribute to the flourishing of its own and other systems in a measured, if imperfect, way. Ideologies and other myths that give an illusion that we can create any kind of perfect response are harmful. We need instead to develop a more nuanced, a more focused understanding of ourselves, more acceptance of the kind of creatures we actually are, focused often on the struggle to survive, which is written into our genes. But we do have the capacity to do more than just survive, or just survive for the short term, and to step back in the Zen sense and observe what is going on while it is happening. This capacity is the response that we have. It may seem like a small thing, but it alters all our interactions with one another and with ourselves. In the Zen sense, there is no difference between how we act towards others and how we act towards ourselves. They're simply reflections of one another. If we can allow compassion to be elicited in the momentary reflection of our situation at each moment, and if we can demonstrate, perhaps through education and by living in this way, then we have a chance to alter the trajectory of the juggernaut we currently inhabit, hurtling towards the cliff edge of mass suffering. I think this is a worthwhile project, but it is not out there that it has to change. It is in here. Okay, so I'm open to questions. I know that, you know, I've said quite a lot in that time. And I know that I use the word agency in quite a specialised sense. That's because I'm a philosopher.
Excuse me, do you not believe that the law of the jungle will always rule, and that you will always have this strong ruling the weak, that we really evolved from the animal, which I believe, and that at the end of the day, really it's about survival of the fittest, and it will always happen, and we will always self-destruct, because it seems to be in the animal and human nature to self-destruct. And also I feel that technology is erasing empathy utterly. It's happening rapidly. We see it in kids, we see it in adults, we see it in people. They're on the phone the whole time at this game. They're going up the street with their phone at their ear. Empathy is really and truly going, and I think as long as that happens, we're going to become robotic people, and that's where the human is going. That's my opinion.
Okay.
Maybe an uneducated opinion, nonetheless, it's my interesting.
It's interesting, yes, thanks. You've made about 3 points there, and I'm going to tackle the last one first, if you don't mind, which is that you said, you know, young people, and I'm looking at my daughter in this room, and I know that, you know, that her generation is going to meet these challenges, these next challenges. I also work with people, is going to have to meet these challenges. So do I think that my daughter is less compassionate than I am? Certainly not.
Going to become so eventually?
No,
not just her, but...
Yeah, absolutely. I understand the larger context, and I work with people, most of whom are at least 20, 25 years younger than me. I certainly don't see them as behaving less compassionately in the work that I work with people who are deaf and blind, and so it requires an awful lot of empathy and trying to understand what it's like to be in a phenomenological situation which you simply can't imagine, because if you see and if you can hear, then you don't know what it's like. But we're constantly having, and I feel that young people are just as compassionate. Now, obviously that's not evidence, that's my feeling, but Steven Pinker has written a book called The Better Part, The Angels of Our Nature, The Better Part of Our Nature, The Angels of Our Nature, I think it's called, which argues, Steven Pinker has written two really important books recently. The second one is called Enlightenment Now, and that says that on every front of how you might categorize progress, we are making progress as a species. Now, I take him to task when we're talking about the environment, because that's the context within which human societies have to develop. So yes, in human terms, we have made tremendous progress. I mean, Alva, it is Alva, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Alva was talking about women's place in the 1930s and 40s, and how little voice they had. And I mean, we all know as women, I mean, this is a bit of a cliche, but we all know as women how much we talk. We talk at least as much as men. And so it's undoubted that the women were talking to each other at least as much, and that they were telling as many stories, if not more, than the men. But they didn't have a chance even to be recorded. And yet, and now, as women, you know, you can ask me a question, I can stand up here. It's a huge emancipation. So in that sense, we are making progress. So I would say, and Steven Pinker also says that people have not become less compassionate. In fact, the more education people have, the more access to information people have, the more understanding they develop, and the more understanding that they develop, the more compassionate they become, because they become more able to imagine different situations and to see themselves in different situations. There was a thing on the radio, I think it's called, I won't take too long answering the question, but I happened to be listening to the radio yesterday, and I think it's called Mental Health Awareness Week or something. They have a special radio program on for a week, and they were talking about the direct provision and the different people who are in direct provision cooking together and all laughing, all sharing, and these people barely have enough language to communicate. And yet, you know, when people have more access to more global information, they tend to become more compassionate. When people are more isolated and more divided, they tend to think more them and us. That would be.
Isn't technology causing a lot of isolation? Like, kids go up to their bedroom and they're on their app and they're talking to virtual people and they're having likes and not likes. They're having 1,000 friends, as they think, and there isn't one of them probably a true friend, because it's not a flesh and blood friend. You know, that's the type of thing I'm talking about. That's where dehumanization is coming in. That's where lack of empathy to me is coming in, because they're living a lot of the time in a virtual world now. Yeah. That's why I still argue that my point is.
Okay. Well, I mean, all I can really do is point you to the numbers, and I mean, the numbers suggest that societies that are more technological, that have more technology, also have